Hello everyone, welcome back to the comprehensive guide to Gilgamesh. I'm starting this series for two reasons. First off, this is to cover Gilgamesh in a comprehensive guide is a request by, I believe it's pronounced Karan Anilkumar. If I got that wrong, I apologize, but they requested if I could do a guide to Gilgamesh. Absolutely. The reason why I'm starting with the build, how I approach building Gilgamesh is, of course, for the same reason I start with builds for all of my characters. It's important to understand how I approach building before getting into the matches. I think it's a little bit easier to understand my reasoning in the matches. More specifically, the reason why I'm tackling this now is because I just can't I can't get good gameplay of solo lane gameplay if the enemy team keeps surrendering. Although, to be fair, because of the requests that I've gotten, the gods I'm playing in the solo lane are Gilgamesh or Guan Yu, because that's footage I'm trying to get, so I know part of that is going to be frustration by the enemy solo lane, that I'm playing two very powerful, very meta solo laners right now, but be that as it may, because I don't have any good solo lane footage due to the enemy team surrendering too often, we're going to talk about how I approach building Gilgamesh. Okay, now, I touched upon this to an extent in the updated beginner's guide to building for the solo lane, but we're going to go a bit more into the weeds on Gilgamesh specifically, because, again, as a warrior, the way you build warriors in the solo lane can be very different from how you build them everywhere else. And an interesting thing about Gilgamesh as well that not a whole lot of people talk about is that he also makes for an unusually useful support as well, and that's not something a lot of people really talk about. I will talk about that, and you will see footage of that eventually. But we are going to start with him, with how I approach building him in the classically, warrior-type area, specifically in solo lane. So, again, when I build Gilgamesh for the solo lane, most of the time I'm building Bluestone Pendant. Again, this is kind of specifically to keep my opponent guessing a lot of the time, right? I don't want my opponent to start counter-building me before I'm ready, right? The longer I can stall out their anticipations, the better my game will go. So, I typically, again, usually go into Bluestone with the anticipation of going into Corrupted Bluestone, and then I go into Soul Eater as my second item, again, just to keep them guessing. Right? And then I kind of fully decide whether I'm going auto attacks or I'm going ability-based. When I finish up my shield, I'll just pick the appropriate shield for what build I want to go. If I want to go auto attacks, I'm building the Berserker's shield. If I want to go ability-based, I'm going Gladiator's shield. But then comes the question, how do I decide which version of Gilgamesh I'm basically going to be building for? Excellent question. Now, the first thing I do, generally speaking, is look at my team and see, okay, how many auto-attackers are there on the enemy team? How many ability-based people are there on the enemy team? And for the most part, this is actually primarily going to be decided by your jungler, interestingly enough. But think about it logically. Most mid laners are mages, and most mages are ability-based. There are exceptions to this rule. For example, Freya, Kronos, right? These are two prime examples, and most hunters are auto-attack based as well. Every once in a blue moon, specific hunters will build ability-based, such as Kronos or Neith, but for the most part, they're going to be building auto-attack, and then you've got Guardians, who very rarely go auto-attack. So, at the end of the day, you've got the two ability-based of your mid lane and usually your support, right? And then you've got the auto-attacking ADC. And then so if your jungler is ability-based, which a slight majority of them are, then you're going to want to go auto-attack, because usually your opponent won't want to build full anti-attack speed, because the only people it'll affect will be you and the hunter, the mage, the jungler, and the support are all going to, not care, right? But if your jungler happens to be auto-attack based, for example, they're Arachne, or they're going for a full auto Fenrir build as an example, some junglers can do either as well, then you're going to want to go ability based, because if you go auto attack based with an auto attack jungler, right, what's going to happen is your laning opponent is going to favor anti-attack speed items like Witchblade or Frostbound Hammer or Midgardian Mail, and that's going to very severely affect the damage output of not only you and your ADC, but also your jungler. If you go abilities in that case, then they have to make a decision. Do they want to nerf the damage from the ADC and the jungler, or do they want to nerf your damage along with maybe the mid laner? And the nice thing about that as well is because the mid laner is magic damage, it's not really technically possible for them to mitigate both your ability damage and theirs unless they happen to have built Talisman of Energy, the Warding Sigil, as it's called. Right, so which one I pick mostly depends on my jungler. I'll usually pick the opposite damage type that they're going into, and by the time you're ready to finish the shield off, you should be able to pop up the scoreboard and see what your jungler is building in the first place. But that's usually my deciding factor. Every once in a while, my laning opponent is will make this decision. For example, if I'm against Nike or Bologna, I'm going to want to go ability based because they both have disarms. If, say, I'm against, as an example that I've seen recently, Hades, he has a silence. I wouldn't want to go ability based on up against that silence, so I would pretty much by default pick auto attacks. But with the rare exception of an enemy possessing a silence or a disarm, my decision on whether to go ability or auto attack based is primarily based on my jungler. And like I said, every once in a while, somebody will do a slightly wild pick in one of the other roles. A couple of matches ago, I had a Neith that was going ability based, so that kind of changed how I wanted to approach that. I actually wound up going auto attack based, despite having an auto attack based jungler, right? In that particular instance, I had an auto attack build Loki with an ability based build Neith, so I went auto attacks because then my laning opponent was only hurting my damage output and Loki's damage output, and the Neith and the mage were fine, right? Or they would have been if the enemy team hadn't surrendered. But anyways, those are a couple of examples of when I decide and how I decide whether to go auto attack Gilg or ability Gilg, right? So if I'm going with an ability based Gilgamesh, there are a couple of things I generally like to build. The first thing is obviously Glad Shield, right? And then I need my ability based damage type things, and I also need to be building more protections, right? And usually, my magic protections will be, a lot of the times, Bulwark of Hope. Like I said, I really like Bulwark of Hope in general. Sometimes, I'm not sure why I have this here, sometimes I'll go Genji's Guard, it really depends, but a lot of the times my go-to does tend to be Bulwark of Hope. Alright. Especially since Gilgamesh provides himself with 10% lifesteal in the circle he creates when he lands from his jump, which, when combined with Bulwark of Hope, can actually help you gain health in the short term. It's not a whole lot, but combined with Soul Eater, it's a decent amount. It's 25% lifesteal during that time, so... And then I'll usually finish off with some form of delightful physical protections additionally. Now, usually my additional physical protections are either going to be Void Shield if they're really tanky, or it will go into usually Mystical Mail if they're not. This is primarily because for Gilgamesh, he wants items that give him increased health for his Sunforged Scimitar. Even if I'm going ability-based, having more health as a solo laner is not only a good thing, but I can also increase the damage from that ability as well. At least the auto attacks during that ability, so that's a really nice benefit as well. And I like to go Mystical Mail because I can really slap on a large amount of damage, and if you put down your ult, then even if you're not actively focusing on somebody, stuck in your ult, you're focusing on someone else, they're still taking Mystical Mail damage at the same time, right? It's just a happy kind of bonus, right? My last item for Gilgamesh when building this is ability-based Gilgamesh, is it'll usually be, if I need the anti-healing, it'll be Brawler's Beatstick if my jungler is doing poorly, or it will be either Pestilence or Contagion rarely if I really need the protections or the support is doing poorly. again, this is ability based. If I'm auto attack based, then my build obviously changes slightly. Instead of Glad Shield, I'm going Berserker's Shield. Instead of, say, Genji's Guard or Bulwark of Hope, I'm going Shogun's Kusari. And then for extra physical protections, I will usually go into either Stone-Cutting Sword or, again, go into Mystical Mail. It really depends upon how much my allies need physical protection decreases, how squishy the enemy team is. The squishier the enemy team is, the more likely I am to build Stone Cutting, because that's really good against squishy comps. But I've been known to build Mystical Mail as well on occasion. It really depends on the situation. It also depends on, if I have 3 magic damage, like if I have a mage ADC, but the rest of the team is otherwise normal, I'm not going to go Mystical Mail because we already have 3 magic damage sources, mid support and ADC at that point, right? Why would I actually quadruple down on magic damage at that point when the enemy is going to be particularly aware of it, right? So other than that mild exception, also when I'm auto attacking, sometimes I'll go with Void Shield if the enemy team is really tanky. Again, for my final item with auto attacking, again, if I need anti-heal, I'm almost always going Toxic Blade, right? Even if, as an auto-attacking Gilgamesh in the solo lane, my default move here, if I need anti-heal, is Toxic Blade, because it's really tough to beat that huge level of anti-heal that Toxic Blade brings to bear. But if I don't need that, I'm usually going to go into either Executioner or Chin Size a lot of the time, right? And that's generally how I approach auto-attacking with Gilgamesh in the solo lane. Now, this is specifically to keep the enemy guessing, but there are rare occasions when my team does not have enough magic damage, and I decide to go Animosity. There really isn't a big change here in how I build. I still build Berserker's Shield, I still build Soul Eater. Well, excuse me. Pardon me. If I am going for Animosity, I don't build Soul Eater, I build Aussie. Other than that, there is no difference there, so I'll go Animosity, Aussie, Berserker's Shield, good old Shogun's Kusari. I will almost always still go with Mystical Mail in this particular instance, because I am looking for that HP, right? Or Sovereignty sometimes, if the enemy team has enough physical protection, physical damage dealers. Sovereignty is fairly popular for me with Animosity as a result, because there's a lot of physical people. And either I'll finish off with Toxic Blade if I need the anti-healing, or I'll just finish off with, they're not looking at the right thing. I'll finish off with Talisman of Energy if I need the magic protections, right? Or, sometimes I don't need either, I'll go with Frostbound Hammer. Sometimes, right? And that's specific with Animosity. Now, an interesting thing about Gilgamesh, like I said, is he actually plays a fairly impressive support, because he's got a slow on his first ability, he has the push/stun with his kick, his second ability, he has the providing your allies with lifesteal on his third ability, and then his last ability, his ultimate, is a slow to root, right? Possibly a push as well if you're actively attacking in that. Great support ability. Right? If I'm playing support Gilgamesh, I'm usually going War Flag, because usually the team can really use it. Every once in a blue moon, I will instead go for Sentinel's Gift, but this is infrequent enough that I prefer to have War Flag take a starter slot here. Every once in a blue moon, I'll go Animosity support Gilgamesh, but I don't do this very often right now, because a lot of in the current meta, it's pretty decent, but personally, I just prefer not building Animosity as a support. It's just a personal preference of mine. I don't like being that hyper-damaging when I'm supporting, because that's going to take my mindset away from saving my team and more in, I gotta kill this person, right? And that's not a mindset you want to have as a support, so I kind of deviate from my goals mentally when I build Animosity as a support, so I don't do it, but you can. Okay, if you're able to control your bloodthirst and actually stop to save your allies when they need you, right? Other than that, starting with War Flag, I usually don't go with any shields or Soul Eater or anything like that. Usually I'm going to go into one of the 2 auras. Again, Gilgamesh isn't a guardian, so a lot of the time I'm not comfortable building Gauntlet of Thebes. It takes too long. He does too much damage baseline to really be able to effectively build those stacks. It takes a little while. My first move is usually Sovereignty. If the enemy team has a magic predominance, I'll go Heartward, obviously. One of the two. Then build either the other one. Let's take a standard team comp of 3 physical, right? I would build Sovereignty. I would then, with War Flag, be building Shogun's Gusari. I would then typically be building Mystical Mail. Then I would be building Talisman of Energy, right? This, right? This twice, technically speaking. So let's go on ahead and grab the second one of those. And, oops. You're not going to let me. And then if I need anti-healing, again, I'll go Toxic Blade. I prefer this over the usual anti-healing because that's going to be 60% anti-healing rather than the 25% Contagion or Pestilence offers. So if I need anti-healing, it's going to be Toxic Blade as my last item. Sometimes if we're behind, I'll push that up to my 5th item. It happens occasionally, but it's not very common. If I otherwise don't need additional protections in that particular area, then I'll go on ahead and finish with either Frostbound Hammer or something I very rarely build is the Sledge instead. Great item. So I'll usually build something along those lines. Again, I build just Frostbound Hammer often enough that it's the only one that really takes up a slot here. Maybe I might adjust that down now because I do occasionally build the Sledge, so it might be worth just slotting that down. So that is generally how I approach playing support. Is it my favorite way of playing Gilgamesh? No. There are better warriors for this, but he can do it. And if you want to do it, that's totally fine. He is very strong in the support role if you build him correctly and you keep the correct mindset. I've seen people play him in the jungle. You can again, I'll die on this hill. You can technically play anyone anywhere, but why would you want to play someone not great in the role when you can play someone really great in the role? And Gilgamesh has the serious problem in the jungle role of not being fast enough. If you make a mistake with a jungle Gilgamesh, you're going to have a really hard time catching back up, okay? Just because you run slower, baseline, than assassins do, right? And that tends to hold true for ADC Gilgamesh or mid lane Gilgamesh, which I haven't seen, but I'm waiting for the day, right? Now, this all is very specific to playing Gilgamesh in either the support or the solo lane role, very specifically in Conquest, but what about the rest of the modes? What do I usually do then? Well, that becomes a really fascinating question, because how I approach Gilgamesh and his beautiful customizability to the situation really primarily depends on the mode. For Slash, I'm typically going to flex into what the team needs. For example, if we don't have an assassin, I'm going to be building more damage. I'm going to be building the Crusher, right? The Crusher is an absolutely amazing item on Gilgamesh. Absolutely stunning. Something I buy very frequently in non-conquest game modes. Still building Soul Eater, probably will splash some damage in, but I'm really leaning on that damage output. And whether I build Bluestone Pendant or Death's Toll when I'm trying to add more damage in a Slash game is really going to depend on what the team lacks. Again, I'm using an assassin as this particular example is, for me, really going gung-ho on the attack, and I've done that numerous times. What I've done just about as much, if not slightly more often, is our team lacking a Guardian, so I wind up building absolutely full tank. I go War Flag, I go Shogun's Gusari, I go Sovereignty, I go Heartward, I go the full 9 yards, right? It really depends on what class your team is missing, since most Slash matches actually wind up with 2 mages, 1 hunter, a warrior, and a Guardian. So a lot of the times, I would say, at least in this year so far, I've been primarily playing Gilgamesh in a more damaging role. I'll usually splash in some form of protections. I'm very fond of continuing to splash in Gladiator's Shield, for instance, and keeping Corrupted Bluestone as well, rather than the Bluestone Brooch. But that is just me adapting to basically what that team is. And so basically what you're trying to do as Gilgamesh in Slash is you look at your team composition and you ask yourself, okay, what do we not have? Do we have an assassin? No? Build like an assassin. Build like a mildly tanky assassin. Do we have a Guardian? No? Build like a slightly aggressive Guardian, right? That's how you want to approach it. A lot of the times, a lot of the times your team is going to need protections more often. Like I said, typically 2 mages, that's 2 sources of damage there. I'll typically splash in a little bit of damage, such as maybe Chin Size if I'm going auto attack, or maybe Glide Shield if I'm going ability based, something along those lines. But, you know, a lot of the times I'm going with the defense, because that's more often than not what people try to avoid being is defensive, right? A lot of players like playing the damaging roles, especially in Slash, so whenever I play Slash, at least based on my personal experience, a lot of the times I'm playing Gilgamesh in a much tankier role than I even typically play him in Conquest. I usually build him almost full tank, whereas, as you saw before, it's a bit more hybrid with the solo lane, right? In Joust, I generally utilize auto attacks because they just happen to be that much more effective. Very specifically, I build animosity almost all the time in Joust. Why is this? Well, very simply, it's because it's a hell of a lot faster. Okay? This evolves at level 15, in fact, so does Warflag, and Joust tends to be a much shorter game mode. Now, I actually also apply the same logic to Arena. Much shorter game mode, I typically build Animosity there if I need damage. If for some reason I need to be tanky as Gilgamesh, I'll build Warflag and run the same. I'll basically play support Gilgamesh, right? My build for building support Gilgamesh carries through when I'm playing frontline, tank Gilgamesh in other modes. But for the warrior version of Gilgamesh, this changes very drastically. Now, again, I'll go back to saying what I said in my updated beginner's guide to the solo lane. Gilgamesh is one of the extremely few people that I prefer animosity on over Chin Size, and that absolutely holds true, particularly in Arena and Joust. Again, I'm building animosity because I get to evolve it at level 15, which gives me a huge spike in damage. I get to splash in quite a bit of defensive items, which gives basically my team 1.5 frontline, including the usual frontline, assuming there is one. And if for some reason my team just needs more defense, I can easily splash that on without damaging my ability to hit the enemy hard too much. Right, so for Arena and Joust, I am usually going by default Animosity because I can evolve that at level 15, which is going to give me a huge power spike before the end of what would otherwise be a very short match, right? To that end, when I do play very specifically Arena or Joust, and I am going Animosity, we are building, obviously, Benevolence, but my first item isn't going to be Asi. Okay, this is going to surprise some people, but whereas it would normally be Asi in the solo lane, because both Joust and Arena have pretty short, what I guess I would call supply trains back to the fountain. It's a pretty short run from fountain to wherever the scene of the fight is in most cases. I actually don't often build that much in the way of lifesteal, if any at all. And in fact, when I'm going with Animosity specifically, I will usually rush to build Berserker's Shield a lot of the times. Every once in a blue moon, the enemy team just has so much magic damage on their team that I build Shogun's Kusari, but I'm building one of these two first, and then the whichever one I didn't build, I'm building third, right? Or I build second and third. Then I will usually capitalize by going into, a lot of the times, Stonecutting Sword, if I'm going for that aggressive look. If I'm not going for that aggressive look, I'll grab Frostbound Hammer, or a lot of the times I've also found myself building Void Shield and then going into Talisman of Energy. Again, it's kind of like support Gilgamesh, but instead of Warflag, you're building Animosity. Again, if I'm looking for anti-healing, I'm going Toxic Blade. I'm really fond of things out of this whenever I don't need anything specific. Absolutely fantastic. And that's generally how I'm going to approach him. Now, there is an interesting thing that I've discovered is very effective on Gilgamesh as well, if you really need a heavy amount of damage on Gilgamesh, and that is Death's Toll, right? Death's Toll I've been experimenting with recently. The jury is still a little out on this, since this tends to be fairly inconsistent with how effective it is compared to some of these other options that Gilgamesh has, but so far preliminary research has indicated that this can be very effective. Not necessarily in the solo lane, again, this gives away your game too much, basically, but in every other mode, particularly Slash, I'm finding is very useful. This is a great way to sustain yourself through, set up a really great auto attack build later on. You can use either Death's Temper or Death's Embrace depending on how aggressive you want to be. Again, as a farmer support main, I tend to go Death's Embrace a bit more. It's more my speed, but Death's Temper is something I play with occasionally and is very effective. So in Slash, Death's Toll can be very effective for an auto attack build. It's going to offer you a lot of sustain. You go into Aussie, you go into Executioner, you go into maybe Chin Size if you really want to. You throw in Berserker's Shield, you throw in Shogun's Kusari, and you're decently tanky. Put in the, Aussie, Chin Size, Executioner, you have a really nice tanky build there. Or instead of Executioner, maybe the enemy team is particularly squishy, you go Stone Cutting Sword, which is basically triggers the same effect but much weaker, right? Maybe the enemy team doesn't have a lot of escapes and you want to throw in a delicious Frostbound Hammer. Totally fine, right? That's, it's something I've been experimenting with on the side, and so far, like I said, it has proven to be effective in Slash, but inconsistent everywhere else compared to what he can already do. So I just kind of wanted to broach this subject really quick with Gilgamesh. It's hard talking about Gilgamesh because, like I said, he is so incredibly versatile in build. It's not so much that an item can't work well on him, it's more of how well do these items work together, right? Because literally he can pick up any item and use it well. I'm not kidding. That is complete fact. What matters is how well does that item work with the other things that you've built. Because building, say for example, throwing in one random crit item in an otherwise full tank build isn't going to do you any good. As an example, it's an extreme example and clearly very silly, but it doesn't really, work out. So what I'm going to do, and probably spend quite a bit of time doing, because Gilgamesh is so absolutely fascinating to play as a god, I will probably make quite a long series as a comprehensive guide on Gilgamesh, detailing very specifically, my decision making on his build, where I'm going with it and why, and the adjustments I'm making per mode. And for Gilgamesh very specifically, I am going to talk about, I'm going to go start with Arena. I know Karan plays Joust. I know they're a Joust main, but I do want to talk about team fighting with Gilgamesh first, so I'm going to start with an Arena, one or two arenas, and then go into... Well, I suppose I could just shortcut to Joust really quick for the next episode. That shouldn't really be too much of an issue. You'll find, I suspect, that a lot of the times you're going to wind up playing support Gilgamesh. War Flag or Animosity, your choice. Whenever I'm in that position, like I said before, I tend to go War Flag, because that's really going to help out your Hunter, who is going to be quite impactful a lot of the times. But if for some reason you have an ability-based assassin, you might as well go Animosity at that point, right? I will talk about it, but I just kind of wanted to go into a brief overview of my general approach to Gilgamesh. Again, as one final reminder before I end the episode, it is tough to talk about building Gilgamesh outside of specific contexts because he is so very customizable, right? So this is kind of like a prelim to give you an insight into what the comprehensive guide to Gilgamesh is going to look like, what I'll be really talking about, and how I'm going to generally approach this. So yeah, with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. I know this doesn't really cover as much as I would like, but it is very difficult to talk about him, like I said, removed from context. So we're going to give him some context next episode for this series and talk about it, right? So with that being said, thank you all very much for joining me. If you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.